In 1986, Hollywood had completely abandoned the American Western. The genre was considered dead at the box office, a dusty artifact of a bygone era. Yet one man refused to let the cowboy myth die, stepping onto a scorching set in Texas to tell a brutal story of sin, blood, and salvation. That man was country music legend Willie Nelson. He was not just starring in a movie, he was fighting to bring his ultimate artistic obsession to life. Red-Headed Stranger was not an ordinary film. It was born from a revolutionary concept album that changed music history forever, transforming a tragic tale of betrayal and frontier vengeance into a cinematic reality. Welcome to YesterFrame HQ. Today, we step back into 1986 to uncover 15 shocking facts about Red-Headed Stranger. We will explore the lost studio deals, the near-fatal budget disasters, and the incredible true story of a movie set that became a real Texas town. Before we ride into the dusty trails of West Texas, take a moment to subscribe to YesterFrame HQ and join our community. Your support allows us to bring you the deep cinematic history behind the films that defined a generation. Fact 1. The impossible album that Hollywood insisted would fail. Long before cameras rolled on the 1986 film, the story began as a quiet gamble in a Nashville recording studio. In 1975, Willie Nelson presented his record label with a stark, stripped-down concept album about a heartbroken preacher who turns into a cold-blooded killer. The studio executives were horrified. They called the sound thin, unfinished, and uncommercial, even suspecting it was a demo track rather than a completed record. But Willie held his ground. He refused to add polished orchestrations or heavy studio production, trusting the raw power of the narrative. When the album was finally released, it became a cultural phenomenon, selling millions of copies and creating an indelible myth in the minds of listeners. That success proved that audiences craved authentic, dark Western mythology, setting off a 10-year struggle to turn the song cycle into a motion picture. A simple tale of murder and grace had captured the nation, proving that the public wanted grit over Hollywood glamour. Fact 2. The Robert Redford deal that almost rewrote Western cinema. When Hollywood finally took notice of the album story, Willie Nelson did not initially plan to star as the preacher himself. In the late 1970s, major studio executives saw the cinematic potential and reached out to one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, Robert Redford. Redford was deeply intrigued by the dark, mournful themes of preacher Julian Shay. Early development discussions began with Redford attached to direct and star in the project, while Willie Nelson was slated to compose the soundtrack and play a supporting role. However, creative differences and endless studio delays stalled the production for years. Redford eventually moved on to other projects, leaving the film stranded in development hell. Many industry accounts suggest that this setback was actually a blessing in disguise. It forced Willie Nelson to step into the lead role himself, creating an authentic performance that no traditional Hollywood star could ever replicate. The loss of a megastar paved the way for something far more genuine, an outlaw singer wearing his own tragedy on his sleeve. Fact 3. Built from scraps, the birth of Luck, Texas. By the time production was ready to start in the mid-1980s, traditional studios refused to provide a full budget for a period Western. Instead of abandoning the dream, Willie Nelson decided to finance a massive portion of the film himself. Rather than renting an expensive Hollywood backlot, he bought land on his own private ranch in Spicewood, Texas, and built a full-scale Western town from the ground up. Crew members used reclaimed wood, rustic props, and historic designs to build churches, saloons, and homesteads. The town was constructed so solidly that it did not just serve as a movie set, it became a permanent settlement known as Luck, Texas. Today, that very set still stands on Willie Nelson property, hosting music festivals and standing as a living monument to independent filmmaking. What began as a desperate attempt to save a low-budget film ended up creating a piece of American history that survives to this day. Fact 4. The unforgiving heat and authentic Texas grit. Filming in Central Texas during the mid-80s was not a comfortable Hollywood studio production. It was an extreme test of physical endurance. Willie Nelson wanted absolute realism for his Western, refusing to shoot on sanitized sound stages in California. The cast and crew were subjected to scorching summer heat waves in Spicewood, Texas. The heavy dust, pouring sweat, and deep sunburns visible on camera were completely real. In the story, water is a precious commodity that men are willing to kill for. Off-screen, the production genuinely battled the harsh elements every single day with limited resources and minimal air conditioning. That relentless physical misery gave the film a raw, unpolished atmosphere that money could never buy. The actors were not pretending to be exhausted on the frontier, they were living it under the blazing Texas sun. Authentic pain created an authentic Western, turning low-budget struggles into cinematic gold. Fact 5. Morgan Fairchild breaking her Hollywood image. Casting the role of the preacher unfaithful wife required an actress who could embody both striking beauty and deep tragic flaw. The production turned to television star Morgan Fairchild, a decision that surprised many industry insiders at the time. Fairchild was famous for her glamorous roles in high-profile primetime soap operas. Taking a role in a gritty, low-budget independent Western was a massive creative gamble for her established career. She played Randa, the woman who abandons Reverend Julian Shay for another man, setting off a chain reaction of tragedy and bloodshed. Fairchild stripped away her polished Hollywood image, delivering a vulnerable performance that grounded the emotional stakes of the film. Her character choices made the preacher betrayal feel deeply personal and utterly devastating. A television icon stepped into the dusty backcountry, proving that true talent thrives when stripped of glamour. Fact 6. The dark transformation from preacher to cold-blooded outlaw. On paper, a mainstream film about a holy man who becomes a murderous avenger was a dangerous narrative to sell to American audiences. Traditional Westerns preferred clear heroes and obvious villains, but Red-Headed Stranger shattered those boundaries. The story follows Reverend Julian Shay as he travels west to spread the gospel, only to lose his church, his wife, and his spiritual foundation. When he catches his unfaithful wife with her lover, he snaps, shooting them both in a sudden explosion of fury. That terrible act transforms him into the legendary Red-Headed Stranger, a quiet wanderer haunted by his own sins. Willie Nelson insisted on keeping this dark, morally gray trajectory intact from the original album. It forced viewers to sympathize with a deeply flawed killer, exploring complex themes of guilt, divine judgment, and tragic redemption. The film dared to show that loss can twist even the most pious soul into a vengeful phantom. Fact 7. A brotherhood of outlaws behind the camera. Behind the scenes, the production felt less like a corporate film set and more like a gathering of close friends and trusted allies. To preserve the intimate soul of the story, Willie Nelson brought his own inner circle into the project. Band members, family, and trusted country music companions took on acting roles, stunt work, and behind-the-scenes responsibilities. This unconventional approach kept costs low while maintaining complete creative control over the vision. The natural camaraderie between the cast members translated directly onto the screen. The quiet nods, shared glances, and rugged interactions felt like genuine interactions between real men of the Old West. It was not merely a commercial movie venture. It was a collective passion project created by musicians and storytellers who lived the outlaw lifestyle. Trust and loyalty replaced studio executives, giving the film a heartbeat that felt truly independent. Before we dive into the most brutal secrets behind the film Iconic Showdowns, let us pause for a quick moment. If you are enjoying this deep dive into forgotten cinema, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to YesterFrame HQ. Your support allows us to keep resurrecting these legendary stories from film history. Share your thoughts in the comments if you remember watching Willie Nelson in this classic role. Now, let us ride back onto the dusty trail. Fact 8. The deadly war over West Texas water. In the brutal world of Red-Headed Stranger, nature itself acts as a relentless antagonist. The core conflict of the narrative heavily revolves around a contested windmill and a precious water well on the dry frontier. Historical range wars in the American West were rarely fought over gold or land titles. They were fought over basic survival. The film captures this harsh historical reality with terrifying precision, depicting how quickly law and order collapse when water runs dry. The struggle between the local settlers and the greedy Clabber family over the town water supply creates a constant layer of tension throughout the story. Men bleed and die not for glory, but for a single bucket of muddy water. This grounded focus on frontier survival grounded the movie in historical truth, showing that the West was a place of unforgiving desperation. A simple windmill became a symbol of life and death, proving that the frontier spared no one.
Fact 9. A soundtrack stripped of Hollywood spectacle.
In traditional 1980s westerns, studios relied on sweeping orchestral themes to signal danger and triumph. Red-Headed Stranger took the exact opposite approach, relying almost entirely on Willie Nelson acoustic guitar and minimalist arrangements. Every chord played on Trigger Willie' iconic beat-up Martin guitar echoed the silence of the Texas landscape. The lack of heavy music created an overwhelming sense of intimacy and dread. According to later production accounts, sound editors realized that ambient noise, the wind blowing through dry brush and the creaking of timber, was more powerful than any orchestra. The score did not tell the audience how to feel, it forced them to sit with the haunting silence of a dying frontier. Minimalist music turned a simple western into a solemn, almost religious meditation on loss.
Fact 10.
The grim reality of frontier justice. One of the most tense sequences in the film involves the threat of public hangings and mob rule in the town of Risco, Montana. The script portrayed the law not as a noble force, but as an unpredictable weapon.
In the story, the lines between justice and murder are blurred beyond recognition. Townspeople stand by as corrupt ranchers manipulate the legal system to eliminate their enemies.
Many accounts suggest that the filmmakers studied authentic court transcripts and county records from the late 1800s to craft these brutal scenarios.
The fear on the faces of the extras during the hanging scenes was remarkably genuine,
driven by stark set design and shadowy lighting. It revealed a terrifying historical truth, that in the Old West, the gallows were often used to steal property rather than uphold righteousness. Justice was rarely soft, leaving moral men with no choice but to take the law into their own hands.
Fact 11. Practical gunplay and vintage black powder.
Long before modern computer graphics made film violence clean and seamless, Red-Headed Stranger relied on dangerous, old-school practical effects. The armorers on set insisted on using authentic 19th century revolvers and rifles. The black powder weapons used during the shootout scenes produced thick clouds of blinding white smoke. Cast members often had to navigate gunfights while completely blinded by real sulfur emissions. The physical reactions seen on screen were unscripted responses to loud explosions and heavy recoil. Willie Nelson himself insisted on handling his firearms with total authenticity, spending hours practicing quick draws until the movement became second nature. The smoke and grease were real, giving every gunfight a chaotic, terrifying sense of danger. Fact 12. The battle for independent distribution. When Red-Headed Stranger was finally completed, major Hollywood distributors did not know how to market an independent, melancholic western starring a country singer. Major studios viewed the film as too bleak for mainstream movie theaters and too traditional for art house audiences. Distribution was initially limited, forcing the filmmakers to rely on regional release strategies across the American South and West. Despite the lack of major studio backing, grassroots audiences flooded local theaters. Word of mouth spread rapidly among country music fans and Western enthusiasts alike. Critics who initially dismissed Willie Nelson as an untrained actor were forced to retract their reviews, praising his quiet, terrifying dignity on screen. An independent film ignored by Hollywood executives proved that true cinematic power comes from authenticity, not studio marketing. Fact 13. The unexpected savior of a forgotten genre. In 1986, every major studio executive in Los Angeles shared the exact same belief. They believed the American Western was dead, buried, and completely irrelevant to modern movie audiences.
The catastrophic financial failure of the 1980 film Heaven's Gate had traumatized Hollywood producers, causing them to pull the plug on almost every period Western in development across the country. Studios viewed cowboy hats, dusty trails, and gunfights as box office poison. But Willie Nelson did not care about Hollywood statistics, market research, or corporate trends. He remained convinced that the myth of the American West still held a sacred place in the hearts of working-class people. When major distributors refused to give Red-Headed Stranger a traditional national release, the filmmakers took a massive gamble. They bypassed the elite coastal theaters and released the movie directly into regional theaters across Texas, Oklahoma, and the American South. What happened next caught the film industry entirely off guard. Grassroots audiences flooded local theaters, waiting in long lines under the hot sun to see their outlaw hero on the big screen. The film's unexpected financial success proved that audiences had not abandoned the Western, they had simply rejected sanitized, artificial studio films. Film historians now acknowledge that this quiet, independent triumph helped break the Hollywood ban on Westerns, clearing a path for the massive 90s Western revival that later brought masterpieces like Dances with Wolves and Unforgiven to the world. A lone country singer on a beat-up horse had shown the entire film industry that raw human truth will always outlast corporate cynicism. Fact 14. The Sacred Physical Monument of Luck, Texas. On a standard Hollywood production, movie sets are treated as disposable props. The moment the director yells "cut" on the final day of filming, workers arrive with sledgehammers to tear down the fake wooden facades and throw them into dumpsters. But the dusty town constructed for Red-Headed Stranger was never meant to be disposable. Built on Willie Nelson private property in Spicewood, Texas, the set had been erected out of sheer financial desperation because the production could not afford studio backlot fees. When filming wrapped in the mid-1980s, Willie looked at the wooden chapel, the rustic saloon, and the weathered storefronts and made an unusual decision. He refused to let anyone tear the town down. Over the next several decades, severe Texas heat waves, flash floods, and violent storms repeatedly threatened to destroy the fragile wooden structures. Instead of letting nature take its course, Willie personally spent thousands of dollars out of his own pocket to repair, rebuild, and preserve every single building. What began as a temporary set for a low-budget movie slowly transformed into an actual living community known as Luck, Texas. Today, the town stands as a world-famous cultural sanctuary. Every year, thousands of music lovers gather on the property for the renowned Luck Reunion Music Festival, where legendary artists perform their songs on the very same dusty ground where Reverend Julian Shay once walked. What was built out of financial necessity in 1985 became an immortal piece of American cultural heritage that survives to this day. Fact 15. The raw autobiographical mirror of an outlaw soul. The deepest, most haunting secret behind Red-Headed Stranger is that Willie Nelson was not merely acting out a fictional script. He was laying bare his own real-life soul on camera. During the mid-1980s, Willie was quietly facing immense personal turmoil. He was locked in a brutal financial battle with the federal government, dealing with painful personal losses and carrying the overwhelming weight of maintaining his artistic independence in an industry that constantly tried to control him. The tragic journey of Reverend Julian Shay, a pious man who loses his church, loses his wife, and loses his peace of mind, only to wander through a dark wilderness of sin before finding a quiet form of grace, mirrored Willie's own personal worldview. Crew members on set observed that during the film's quietest, most emotionally devastating moments, Willie did not rely on traditional Hollywood acting techniques. He simply stood in front of the camera and allowed his genuine weariness, his grief, and his quiet resilience to bleed into the frame. When you watch the preacher sit silently by a campfire in the Texas night, staring into the embers with tired eyes, you are not watching a performance. You are watching a real man who had lived through his own wilderness, carrying the heavy scars of his journey. That absolute transparency gave the film an authenticity that no trained studio actor could ever imitate. He poured his own blood, his own faith, and his own outlaw soul into every single frame, turning a simple story of revenge into an eternal meditation on human vulnerability. When we look back at Red-Headed Stranger 4 decades after its release, we realize it was never just a movie. It was an uncompromising act of artistic defiance. It began as a sparse concept album that record label executives called an uncommercial disaster. It survived a 10-year battle through development hell, the loss of major Hollywood stars, and the complete rejection of traditional film studios. It forced a group of independent filmmakers to build their own town in the Texas dirt, face the scorching heat without studio backing, and tell a story that dared to explore the darkest corners of human grief and redemption. Hollywood told Willie Nelson that his story was too quiet, too dark, and too old-fashioned for the modern world. But Willie trusted his audience, trusted his roots, and trusted the eternal power of a simple story told with absolute honesty. The studio executives who rejected the project have long been forgotten, but the story of the red-headed stranger riding his black horse across the dry Texas landscape continues to live on in the hearts of those who value truth over glamour.
Reverend Julian Shay may have ridden away into the dusty shadows of history, but the monument Willie Nelson built in the Texas dirt still stands, reminding us that true art cannot be bought, sold, or broken.
Thank you for joining us on this cinematic journey into the past on YesterFrame HQ.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten cinema history, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep resurrecting these legendary stories and preserving the heritage of classic filmmaking.
Do not forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode, and leave a comment below to tell us what classic film or television masterpiece you want us to explore next. Until next time, keep the frame alive.